About 150 years ago, from 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War occurred. Now, anytime there's a civil war, that's because there are warring factions or different sides that claim allegiance to the same country. In the case of the American Civil War, the warring factions included the Confederacy or the Southern states versus the Union or the Northern states. Now, there is a disagreement between scholars that study the Civil War period about the specific causes that led to the South seceding or leaving the Union and triggering the Civil War. However, generally, there is consensus about 5 causes that led to the beginning of the Civil War. Those causes include slavery, sectionalism, territorial crisis, national elections, and states' rights. Now, the American Civil War, as all civil wars, was and still is today our most bloody conflict. The American Civil War resulted in at least 600,000 deaths. And that's 600,000 deaths on both sides, North and South. And because most of the Civil War was fought in the South, it literally left many Southern states and communities devastated. Now, when we look at the Civil War from a military standpoint, we're primarily looking at 2 personalities. In the South, we had Robert E. Lee. By far, Robert E. Lee was one of the South's most able military commanders. Now, Robert E. Lee started off as the commander of the Army of Virginia, which was by far the South's largest unit and from the South's probably most prominent state, Virginia. Eventually, Lee would be promoted to Commander-in-Chief of Confederate forces. Then for the North, you had General Ulysses S. Grant. At the beginning of the Civil War, Lincoln, who was the president at that time, had to go through many generals in order to find one that could actually come up with a strategy to defeat the South and bring the Union back together. Eventually, Lincoln would settle on Grant. He would be promoted to be commander of all Union forces, and eventually he became the 18th president of the United States. Now, looking at the Civil War, there were many battles. Some historians would say that there was an engagement during the Civil War nearly every day from 1861 to 1865. But we see here in 1860, Lincoln was elected. The South is beginning to realize that because of their economic position, which is translating to their political position, they are losing a lot of influence in the United States when it comes to national elections. Now, 1861, Southern forces fire on Fort Sumter, where there are Union forces located. This signals the beginning of the Civil War in Fort Sumter, South Carolina. By 1863, we have this great battle in Pennsylvania called the Battle of Gettysburg. There were many casualties, and this battle was a signal of the tide turning from the South to the North, an eventual victory by 1865 at the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, where Lee surrenders to Grant and the Civil War ends.
The Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is a statement that was adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776. And it was adopted by the 13 American colonies who formed the Continental Congress. Now, the Declaration of Independence said that King George III of Britain had violated the rights of American colonists. He had put into effect different laws and taxes on the American colonists that seemed unfair to them and took away some of their rights. So the Continental Congress convened to try to come up with a solution. Fighting had already been going on for over a year at the time that this Second Continental Congress occurred, and they decided there wasn't going to be a peaceful way to solve things with Britain. So they declared themselves independent. They said King George had violated the rights of these American colonists, and therefore it announced that the 13 colonies considered themselves as independent states, no longer part of the British Empire. Instead, they said that they formed a new union of those 13 states to be known as the United States of America. So they had tried to work things out peacefully. King George did not take back those laws and taxes. Instead, he fought the American colonists whenever they rebelled against following those laws and paying those taxes. And so after a year of fighting, the Continental Congress met again, and they formed this Declaration of Independence. They declared that they were independent of Britain and that they were their own nation now, to be known as the United States of America. They were no longer part of the British Empire. John Adams was a leader at the Continental Congress, and he pushed for independence. So at first, not everyone was for independence. They thought that was a little radical. They thought maybe they could still make things work with Britain. But after a year of fighting, John Adams was still pushing independence, and it was sounding better to everyone. So on July 2nd, 1776, all 13 colonies unanimously approved this idea to declare themselves independent from Britain. John Adams convinced the committee to allow Thomas Jefferson to write the draft. So Thomas Jefferson wrote the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. Congress edited the draft, and the final version was ratified, which means approved. Everyone agreed to it, and it was ratified by all 13 colonies, or states as they were to be known, on July 4th, 1776. So this date is our date of independence. The day we celebrate as Independence Day was the day that our Declaration of Independence had been edited and everyone signed it and approved it. Everyone who was there from the 13 colonies as representatives at this Continental Congress. Now, Jefferson was influenced by John Locke, who was a 17th century writer, and this was evidenced in his ideas about natural rights. John Locke had written about natural rights, and Jefferson included this in his declaration. Jefferson asserted that people had natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So John Locke had said people have the right to life, liberty, and private property. So Jefferson subbed happiness for private property. While, of course, I'm sure he still meant that people could have private property, he put it in a little bit broader terms. Everyone is entitled to life. Everyone is entitled to liberty, to be free, and everyone is entitled to pursue happiness. And they felt like King George had infringed on some of those natural rights. And so Jefferson was using most of what John Locke had written whenever he wrote life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as natural rights that were being violated in the Declaration of Independence. Now, Jefferson felt and had the Declaration reflect that the purpose of government was to protect the rights of people. Individual rights were more important than the individual's obligations to the state. King George had the opposite idea, and he was trying to force his laws and his taxes on the colonists. So people who were signing the Declaration of Independence were agreeing that people's individual rights were more important than their obligation to the state or to their government. So people's individual rights should come first, and then their obligations to the state. And that is what Jefferson was trying to reflect in the Declaration of Independence. So on July 4th, 1776, all 13 colonies, all representatives from those 13 colonies, to be known as states, ratified the Declaration of Independence, which declared that King George had violated rights of American colonists, and now those 13 colonies were to be known as the United States of America, a separate new nation that was no longer tied to the British Empire.
Neutrality is important in your writing to help you avoid sounding biased. So one thing you want to avoid in your writing is using the pronoun I a lot. Like you don't want to say I believe, or I feel, or I think. And why don't you want to use these things? It's because you're using the pronoun I. Everything's focused on what you see in a situation, whereas your reader is more interested in facts generally. Now sometimes in certain essays or certain papers, you are asked to persuade someone or to give your opinion about something. So in that case, yes, you should use I. But even then, when you're talking about facts, you want to avoid using I, because that means you're being biased. You're presenting your own opinion rather than the facts. And even in facts, sometimes we're still going to be a little bit biased. We're only going to present the facts that we feel are important, or the way that we present the facts is going to be biased. The important thing is that you're still not using the pronoun I, because when you use the pronoun I, you immediately alert the reader that you're being biased, and the reader's going to get caught up in that. And when you use the pronoun I, you as a writer are going to tend to write about your own feelings rather than facts. So stray away from that. Now there are times, like in letters and emails, when it's perfectly appropriate to use the pronoun I, because you're talking about yourself generally in letters and emails, and it would be kind of strange if you didn't use the pronoun I. So you just have to know when it is appropriate to use the pronoun I. But just make sure you're avoiding being biased in your papers when it's important to be neutral.
French and Indian War. There are many events that led up to the French and Indian War. The Spanish Armada, which was their fleet of ships, was defeated by England in 1588. This led to a decline in Spanish power in Europe. So you had Spain, France, and England, who all were very powerful in Europe. After the Spanish Armada was defeated by England, the Spanish power started to decline. So then France and England became the most powerful nations in Europe. This led them to fight several wars between 1689 and 1748. This is especially important because there were powerful nations in Europe that were colonizing. So they were both big into colonizing in North America, and Spain had been as well. But after it was conquered, they kind of lost all their colonial territories as well. So the wars that France and England fought were King William's War, or the 9 Years' War, which was fought between 1689 and 1697. Next, you had the War of Spanish Succession, or Queen Anne's War, from 1702 to 1713. Then you had the War of Austrian Succession, or King George's War, from 1740 to 1748. Now, these were all about France and England trying to claim territory in North America that had previously belonged to Spain. The fourth and final war was the French and Indian War, which was fought from 1754 to 1763. And this was fought primarily in North America. since that was the area they were fighting for. They were fighting for the colonial territory in North America that had previously been held by Spain. This war was also called the 7 Years' War. Now I know if you do the math, it adds up to 9 years over here. But the most of the fighting happened from 1756 to 1763, which was where they get the 7 years from. And at times, all 4 of these wars are considered the French and Indian Wars. And the reason they're called that is because the French and the Indians were 2 of the main groups that England was fighting against. So they called it the French and Indian War because they're fighting the French and the Indians, the Native Americans that lived in North America. However, England also had Native Americans that fought on their side. So it wasn't a very aptly named war because they were fighting Indians, but they also had Indians, Native Americans, on their side fighting against the French. The Indians kind of split, and some sided with the French and some sided with the English. So it didn't really make the most sense, but that is still what it's called. It is still referred to as the 7 Years' War by other people who didn't like the name French and Indian War and thought that 7 Years' War was more appropriate since the Indians weren't solely an enemy to the English. They also helped them depending on which tribes we were talking about. Now, the French and Indian War, the final war in this series of 4 wars, resulted in the end of France's reign as a colonial power. So that is why it is so important. Because after this 7-year war, France was defeated and England was able to claim all of the colonies in North America as English colonies or British colonies. So France was kicked out as a colonial power. Still important in Europe, but not as important as it was because it doesn't have the colonial power that it had. It doesn't have those colonies in North America anymore. Now they are all going to be called British colonies. And the costs incurred during this war led to discontent among the colonists, which helped spark the American Revolution. So colonists helped fight. If they were colonists of the French, they helped. If they were colonists of the English, they helped the English. And so these colonists were having to help, but they were also having to help feed British and French troops. They were having to help supply all of their time. So instead of being able to work on making goods or planting crops, they were having to help fight. They were having to give up their weapons, their ammunition. Anything they had was basically going to this war effort. And so at the end of it, they had incurred a lot of costs, and they were very unhappy about this. And as Britain continued to, or England continued to tax them and charge them for things after they just spent all this money on a war, this helped spark the American Revolution. Plate tectonic theory. The theory of plate tectonics states that the lithosphere, which is the upper solid portion of the mantle and Earth's crust, is made up of major and minor plates. And these plates sit on the viscous part of the mantle and move with it. So viscous means that it's like a thick fluid. Think of like honey. Something that's still liquid, it's still fluid basically, but it's real thick. It doesn't pour out like water. It's the slower moving fluid because it's thicker. So there's this thick, viscous, molten liquid part of the mantle, and on top of that sits the solid part of the mantle, and on top of that is the crust. And so the crust of the Earth and the upper part of the mantle form the lithosphere. And the lithosphere is broken up into plates that move around on this viscous fluid. So it's real thick, it doesn't move fast. The plates don't move a lot, they move real slowly. But where they move, things are going to happen. And if you're trying to picture these plates, think of like an orange. If you peeled all of the peel off of an orange and it came off in pieces and then you put them back on where they belonged, the peel would still be covering the earth or covering the orange like the plates surround the center of the earth, but they're not all connected anymore. they have edges that are going to connect to other pieces of peel. And so all together they cover it, but it's in pieces. And that's kind of how the plates that are on Earth are. They all connect and cover up the Earth, but they're not connected as one solid sphere. They are actually lots of different plates that connect together like a puzzle to surround the center of the Earth. So, estimates have us with the number of major plates at around 9 to 15. So they say they've classified the Earth as having 9 to 15 major plates. And because the major plates are really big, it's hard sometimes for them to say, okay, well, does this count as a new one, or is this still one major plate? Or if they find a break in it, do they count it as still part of a major plate with just a little break? Or is that now one major plate and one minor plate? So it's hard to keep track of how many there are. But scientists estimate that we've got 9 to 15 major plates, which are really big ones, like the United States sits on the North American plate, which is pretty much where all the rest of North America sits too. So that's a really big plate. And then the Pacific Ocean sits on the Pacific plate, which is another really big one. And even though there's water covering the whole plate, underneath the water is still Earth's crust. So that is actually still a plate underneath there. The crust underneath the water is part of a plate. And under the Pacific Ocean, it's the Pacific plate. So those are your really big ones. And then you have your number of minor plates. And scientists have that estimate as at as many as 40. So somewhere around 40 plates. There could be a few less. But again, it's hard to keep track of them. And the minor plates are going to be smaller ones, but if they're real mobile ones, then you will see a lot of activity there. If they don't move as much, then not as much activity. So your major plates are going to be the really big ones that you're going to probably hear more about, and then your minor plates are going to be smaller ones that aren't going to have as big of an impact. Now, the area where two plates touch is called a boundary. And there are 3 different types of plate boundaries. So where two plates touch, something's going to happen. They're going to have some interaction. If you rub two things together, they have to do something. One breaks, one bends, or they slide past each other. And so that's basically what happens with your plates. First, you have transform boundaries. And your transform boundaries are just going to slide right past each other. But that sliding motion, where they're just sliding right past each other, is going to cause some friction. If the ground just shifts a little bit when two plates are sliding past each other, you're going to have something happen. And often there are earthquakes that happen around transform boundaries. That is a common event at transform boundaries. So two plates just slide past each other. Neither one of them is going to bend to the other one or break or anything like that. They're just going to slide right past each other. Now, since they're touching, there will be some debris falling off. And during an earthquake, you often see boulders or small rocks falling. And that is because they are still rubbing against each other. There is going to be some friction and some result, but they're simply sliding past each other. Next, we have divergent boundaries. With divergent boundaries, you've got two plates that pull away from each other, forming new crust. So they're connected, and then they start to pull away from each other, and magma is going to come up from the center of the earth, from that viscous part of the mantle, to fill that gap, and it's going to create new crust between the two plates. So they're going to look kind of like this. You've got your two plates moving away from each other, and then you've got new magma coming up to fill it. So a lot of the times at divergent boundaries, you will see volcanoes. The earth's pulling apart, magma's coming up out of the ground. Volcanoes is when magma comes out of the ground, becomes lava, and forms new crust. And finally, you have convergent boundaries. And this is where two plates are going to actually push into each other. And when they push into each other, one plate is going to go under the other plate in a process known as subduction. So one plate gives in and goes underneath the other one. So you've got two plates going toward each other, and one of them is going to dip down, and one of them is going to get to go up over the other. So one is going to practice subduction and go under the other plate. And a lot of times at convergent boundaries, you'll see mountains, because you've got these plates and they push together until one slips under the other one. Well, when you constantly have old crust going under more old crust, it's going to push it up and up and up to where you've got a mountain. The crust is going to gradually keep piling up and making it a thicker crust right at that area. So usually you get mountains at convergent boundaries. So to recap, the movement of plates causes features on Earth's surface, such as earthquakes, volcanoes, and mountains. Your plates can be major plates, which are the bigger ones that have more of an impact whenever they come into contact with each other. And your minor plates, which are smaller and usually don't have as much of an impact. And you've got three different kinds of plate boundaries that are responsible for different features of the Earth. Transform boundaries are plates sliding past each other, and they result in earthquakes a lot of the time. Divergent boundaries have plates pulling apart. New magma comes up to fill that gap and form new crust, and usually you have volcanoes at divergent boundaries. And then you have convergent boundaries, where two plates are pushing against each other. One goes underneath the other in a process known as subduction. Slowly that crust gets thicker and thicker as this keeps happening, and you usually get mountains at convergent boundaries. And all of this is going on with the different plates that make up the lithosphere.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the author of the Declaration of Rights of Women. She spent her life working for the rights of women, especially the women's right to vote. Now, working with Lucretia Mott, who is a social reformer and another women's rights activist, she organized the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. And there at the convention was where she wrote the Declaration of Rights. At the convention, she pushed the assembly to adopt a resolution. And this resolution would call for women to gain the right to vote. Now, in 1878, along with Susan B. Anthony, another women's rights activist, they wrote what would become the 19th Amendment. Now, it wasn't until 1920 this was officially ratified. However, it was written in 1878, which was a long time before that. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton lived from 1815 to 1902, so the 19th Amendment happened 18 years after her death. Stanton was an important thinker in the women's rights movement, in addition to being a wife and mother of 7 children.
The first permanent English settlement was Jamestown. Now, Jamestown was established in North America and its establishment date was the year 1607. Now, Jamestown was named after King James I of England. Now, there were a few contributing factors that led to the establishment of Jamestown. Now, one of these factors was the idea that England and Spain, during that period of time in history, were rival military European powers. For the first time, by 1607, England and Spain was experiencing a period of peace. Also, another factor was the idea that the Virginia Company was providing the financial support and the willing settlers. Now, the Virginia Company was a private corporation. That meant that they were putting up the investment, they were shouldering the cost, not the English crown or the English taxpayers. And they were responsible for promoting the settlers to come to Jamestown. Now, it's important to note that the settlers were being lured to Jamestown by the Virginia Company by the idea of experiencing adventure, exercising religious freedom, and these settlers had the idea that they could continue as English subjects in North America. So, we have the first permanent English settlement in North America is Jamestown. It was settled in 1607, and it was settled because you had some very important factors contributing to its establishment. There was peace between England and Spain. You had a private corporation, the Virginia Company, that was providing the money and promoting and luring settlers to Jamestown. And these settlers were willing to come to Jamestown because they had the idea of meeting and experiencing adventure, having religious freedom, and continuing, even in North America, as English subjects.
Nationalism. In the 19th century, the spirit of nationalism that had been building since the Middle Ages reached a critical mass, or a critical level. It had been building for a long time, and now it had kind of finally reached its peak. Nationalism refers to pride in the traditions, culture, language, and past of a certain nation of people. This is important to know because it does not necessarily refer to pride in one's country. And it's important to understand the difference there. Nationalism is referring to traditions, culture, language, and past, the kind of community that is made up a nation. But it doesn't refer necessarily to pride in one's country, especially at this time, because in the 19th century there were many nations of people thrown together as parts of a larger kingdom. There are many instances of this where one ruler would be ruling an entire kingdom, but the kingdom would be made up of several different nations, several different groups of people that used to be nations on their own, but had been conquered by this kingdom, and now is part of this one larger kingdom or country. But individually, those groups of people had their own spirit of nationalism. They enjoyed and celebrated their own traditions and cultures. They had their own languages separate from those of other nations or groups of people within that one country. So it's important to understand the distinction there. The nationalism that was growing at this time in the 19th century and reaching this critical peak wasn't pride in one's country, but pride in the accomplishments of that nation of people, that group of people that had grown together. So it could be a country, but not necessarily so. And the rising tide of nationalism became a concern to the ruling monarchs. Who hoped to hold together multiple distinct nations under their control. So, as I was saying, these ruling monarchs were trying to control lots of different nations that they'd conquered and made into one kingdom. But each of those nations retained their own spirit of nationalism that related to the traditions and past and the languages that they shared, and they didn't necessarily share any of that with the kingdom that had conquered them or the ruling monarch who was supposed to be their leader now. So this worried these monarchs because they didn't want to lose any of these nations that they'd conquered, and they knew that if these people were really fired up about their own beliefs and their own national group, then they might rise up and try to separate from the monarchy. So this was something that monarchs were worried about. However, at this time, the memory of Napoleon, who had conquered lots of Europe during his reign, and the balance of power that was established by the Congress of Vienna after Napoleon was defeated and everyone got their nations back, prevented any large conflicts. So yes, there may have been some uprisings due to nationalism, but for the most part, everyone was still compliant. They still lived within the bounds of their monarchy or their kingdom, even if they were celebrating their own national groups, because this balance of power was established during the Congress of Vienna after Napoleon was defeated. And the balance of power basically said that no one country would try to conquer all the other countries and try to eventually dominate all of Europe again. All of the countries in Europe, or the majority of the large countries in Europe, agreed to this and said, okay, I won't try to conquer any of the other countries if you don't try to conquer this country, and everyone can just kind of keep what they've got at this point. So there were no large conflicts during the 19th century, but there was a renewed sense of nationalism, and it's important to note that that was an increased pride in traditions, culture, language, and a shared past that people that used to be one nation, or possibly still were one nation, that they all shared. It wasn't necessarily pride in one's country, the country being who they were ruled by at that time. Nations were retaining their individual past identities instead of joining to their new ruling monarchies.
Robert E. Lee is known as the commander of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia during the Civil War. When, in 1861, the Civil War first broke out, President Lincoln offered Lee command of the Union Army, but Lee declined because his home state, Virginia, was threatening to secede from the Union. So originally, Robert E. Lee was asked to serve on the Union side of the Civil War, but he ended up being a general, or a commander, on the Confederate side. Now, when the Confederacy was established, Lee became a senior military advisor to President Jefferson Davis, because Jefferson Davis was president of the Confederacy while Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States. Now, Lee led many great battles, but was unable to ever invade the North, and so he ended up surrendering in 1865. And so that's an important date to remember. The war started in 1861 and then ran until 1865. So it lasted 4 years, but it's popularly noted that it lasted 5 Aprils. And so when Lee surrendered, that's kind of known as the beginning of the end of the Confederacy, because within 2 months, the rest of the Confederate armies had also surrendered. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution has had a huge impact on the United States. It was ratified on December 6, 1865. So the 13th Amendment was passed during the Reconstruction Era. And the Reconstruction Era existed after the Civil War ended. So this was a time when the Confederate states that had broken off from the whole United States were joining back together with the northern states to form one complete U.S. again. And so this was a difficult time for the country. A lot of laws had to be passed to help figure out how this is going to happen, how all these states were going to join back together. And in addition, many of the Confederate soldiers had to be granted pardons because they were considered in opposition to the U.S., and so they were committing illegal acts. And so in order for them not to go to prison, they had to be granted presidential pardons. Now, the 13th Amendment freed all slaves, and it also legally forbade slavery in the U.S. So it freed all current slaves and said that slavery could not exist again. Now, slaves were freed without giving monetary compensation to the slave holders. And this is because this was considered an illegal act now, and so it didn't make sense to give money to the people because they were doing something illegal. And it's interesting, though, because these slaveholders saw their slaves as their property. And so since they were losing their property, they would want to be compensated for it. So this was a huge financial loss to the slaveholders. Now, what kind of impact did the 13th Amendment have? Well, for one, it changed the societal composition of the South and some of the border states. Because before, African Americans were generally slaves, but now they are just normal citizens. It also changed the economy. Because like I said earlier, the slaves were considered property, and so these slaveholders had to pay for them initially, but after that, they didn't have to pay wages. Now, if they were going to hire African Americans, they had to pay them wages for their work, and so this changed the economy. In some cases, maybe it was too expensive to own these slaves or to employ these slaves. And so it created economic change in the South. And then civil rights was also born after the 13th Amendment happened, because now at first the idea was these African Americans needed to be freed from slavery. But now that they've been freed, they're not on equal ground with the white people of the U.S. And so that's what happened with the civil rights movement, pretty much starting at this point all the way up into not that long ago, as African Americans and others on their behalf were fighting for equal rights to that of the other Americans. Now, to give you a full context of the 13th Amendment, it has two sections, and so Section 1 says, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, where the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction." So this was saying, like I said earlier, that slavery can never exist again. People could only be made to work, basically, if it was punishment for a crime that they had been convicted for. And so basically what was happening is these slaves were being treated like criminals, even though they were not. And then Section 2 says Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And so that's some of the legislation I was talking about that was born out of the Reconstruction Era. So this 13th Amendment was passed, but now other laws had to be put in place to help this process of the slaves being freed go smoothly. The 14th Amendment was ratified on July 9, 1868, during the Reconstruction Era of the United States. The 14th Amendment declared that all persons born or naturalized were U.S. citizens. So basically, if someone was born in the U.S. or naturalized, they were considered a U.S. citizen. And then it also declared that all citizens were entitled to equal rights regardless of race. So the 14th Amendment basically did two things. First, it defined who a U.S. citizen was, and then it said that all of these citizens have equal rights. Now, the amendment fell short of giving black men the right to vote, but it paved the way for the 15th Amendment, which did give black men the right to vote. Now, this amendment angered women's rights activists because it made the right to vote a male right. And it wasn't much later until the 19th Amendment that women were given the right to vote. Now, the major impact of the 14th Amendment was that human rights were granted at the state as well as the national level through the Due Process Clause. So I'm going to write that on the board because that's really important to remember, the Due Process Clause. So the 14th Amendment said that all people, all citizens, cannot be convicted of a crime unless they've been through the due process of law. And so we could also say that the 14th Amendment granted due process to all citizens. So basically these minority groups, or the black people, couldn't be discriminated against by the court system. They were given the same rights to a fair trial under the Bill of Rights that white Americans were given as well. So again, the 14th Amendment did basically two things. It defined who U.S. citizens were and said that they were all given equal rights. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. Now, this 15th Amendment granted black men the right to vote. It passed because Confederate states were forced to comply based on the Military Reconstruction Act. The Military Reconstruction Act was passed a few years prior by Congress, despite President Johnson's veto. And so this put the Confederate states under military control to aid in the process of Reconstruction, of the southern states being joined together again with the northern states. And so as part of the Military Reconstruction Act, they had to pass the 15th Amendment. And women's rights activists also opposed the amendment because it granted the right to vote to males only. So you can see how much opposition and tension there was with the 15th Amendment, because women's rights activists opposed it, as well as these Confederate and Southern states who had a lot of prejudice against blacks. And so really only through the Military Reconstruction Act could the 15th Amendment most likely come about. Now, women also wanted the right to vote, or these women rights activists wanted the right to vote as well. And so that didn't come about until the 19th Amendment, which came about much later. And so they opposed it because this amendment was making the right to vote a male right only. Because although it was giving it to blacks, and so now it wasn't, before it was just a white male right, and now it was cutting across cultural lines. And so now no longer was it a right of one ethnicity, but it was still just a right of one gender. And so the push for women's rights eventually resulted in the 19th Amendment. But here we're just focusing on the 15th Amendment, and this was the last of three very historic amendments in the U.S. relating to Reconstruction. And that's the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And these had a huge impact on life in the U.S. because they put an end to the era of slavery and were the first steps in giving freedom and equal rights to black people at the state and national levels.
The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution in Europe in the 19th century produced immediate and far-reaching changes in the social structure. New energy sources, such as the steam engine, made great increases in productivity possible. So there were several different new energy sources. They found new ways to use water power. They found, such as with the steam engine, that's harnessing water as steam. They also found new ways to use coal, new ways to practice metallurgy. There was a lot of new ways to use energy that they'd previously used, or newfound sources of energy. And all of those things combined to increase productivity. The factory system for manufacturing textiles was implemented, meaning that individuals were only required to do one in a series of tasks required to prepare a piece of cloth. So each person would know how to do one job, or a couple people would know how to do one job, and then they'd do their one part and pass it off to the next step. And at the next step, a couple of people would know how to do that job, and so no one had to know how to make the whole piece or whole bolt of cloth. They only had to know how to do a certain part of it. And so this division of labor also increased productivity. Before, one person would do all the jobs, and they may be really good at one part but really bad at another part, or they may be really quick at one part but really slow at another part. So this let people work where their strengths could shine and where their strengths would get the most use. So someone who was really fast at the first step of the process could work there, someone who was really fast at the last step could work there, and all the spots in the middle. So everyone was trained to do just one in a series of tasks instead of one person having to do all the tasks. And that made things go quicker and increased productivity. So with the success of the textile industry and new energy resources, more and more workers were needed in European cities. So before, there were people in cities, but there were also a lot of people that lived out in the country on farms or had their own homes on a piece of land where they grew their own food. And there were people that flocked to the cities for art or learning, but they didn't really come there for work as much. Only the merchants could really get a job coming from the farmlands into the city. But now people began to abandon their country lives and take factory jobs in town, in different cities across Europe. Now, industrialization did come to England before it came anywhere else, but it quickly spread throughout Europe and then just a little while later over to America. So once it started, it spread quickly, but it did begin in England. Now, people left their country lives to go work in these factories because now there was a new job there. There was something they could go and have a possible better life than they did on their farms. And this rapid urbanization, which is when urban areas grow quickly, such as the areas within a city or surrounding a city, this rapid urbanization created a new middle class in Europe. So let's look at some of the pros to the urbanization and how that middle class developed. As people flooded the cities to work in booming factories, large landowners consolidated the farmlands they left behind. So people would flood to the cities to work, and they would sell off their farms so that they could make that move and have somewhere to live and a little bit of money to live on while they got set up in their new job. Large landowners would say, okay, we'll stay here and just keep taking all the land, we'll buy it off of them as they leave, and we'll have lots and lots of land, and we can do with it whatever we want to make the most money. So this was a good thing for the large landowners because they were going to be able to have more land. And it did give the people who were flocking to the cities a way to get a little money to start them off, but they were giving up the place that they had lived and had a home and had at least food to eat. Now, they may not have been able to make as much money. If they had just a small area to plant, they may have only been able to make enough food for themselves and not enough to make money. So moving into the cities gave them an opportunity to possibly be able to make more money and become wealthier as a family. The booming success of industry made many people rich as investors and merchants, and the middle class gained even more political power in Europe. So where the middle class didn't have as much political power because they weren't as wealthy as the upper class citizens, now the middle class was becoming richer and it was gaining more political power. Social mobility was much more possible in this economic environment, encouraging many people to stick with jobs that were demeaning and not especially lucrative. Well, social mobility is the idea that you can move from one class to another. So a lower class citizen who may have been virtually a peasant out on the farms may have moved in, got a factory job, people saw that he did a good job and he gets promoted and he makes way more money that way and can actually move up into the lower class and then move into the middle class and maybe even higher. But instead of being trapped in the class that you were born in, there's a lot more mobility. You could sell your farm that had made you plenty of money in hopes of going and investing in a factory in the city, and your factory could fail. So you could drop from middle class or upper middle class to lower class very quickly, or you could go as a peasant or a lower class farmer and do well in one of the factories or become a supervisor there, and you could end up making more money and rise from being lower class up to middle class or higher. So there was a lot more mobility here as far as social class goes, and the reason that I encouraged many people to stick with jobs that were demeaning and not very lucrative was that they had the opportunity to advance. So they may say, okay, well, I'm going to take this factory job. It's not paying me very much money. It's not paying me as much as I could have made on my farm. But if I do a good job, maybe I can move up. Maybe I can save up enough money to be able to invest in something. Maybe I can start my own factory someday. So people had ambition and they envisioned having more opportunity here rather than opportunities out on the farms. There wasn't as much available for them to move social class-wise out there, where in the cities, there was always that possibility. This rapid urbanization also created a number of problems. So many people moving to the city at once would create some problems. First of all, most cities did not have the infrastructure to support a large population explosion. So they didn't have the streets, first of all, but they also didn't have any of the city services in place for such a large population. They were used to maintaining who they had in the city, that level of a population that was slowly growing. They weren't used to having so many people come all at once. So they didn't have the housing, they didn't have sewer, they didn't have running water, they didn't have enough of anything really to take care of all these people. And the roadways, of course, weren't going to be used or used to having that much traffic on them, both foot traffic and different carts and different apparatuses that people are using to move all their stuff from the farm to the city. There's going to be a lot more traffic and there's going to be a lot more people. And the cities weren't prepared for that internally whenever all these people came. And as a result, disease, crime, and poverty were common. So you could end up moving from the lower class up to the middle class, but you could drop down from the middle class to the lower class, or you could just stay in the lower class if that's where you were. If you come in, you don't have a lot of money, you don't have somewhere to stay, you can't stay in an inn, you don't have the money for it, you can't buy your own home. There's a lot that you don't have access to in the city without money. And so poverty was common. Crime was common. If you didn't have money and you couldn't get a factory job, or you weren't making enough of the factory job and your family still needed to eat, then you may steal from someone to be able to make ends meet. And so crime was common. And then disease. With so many people living so closely together, if one person got sick, it was going to spread very quickly. And so disease was common. So there were some negatives to this rapid urbanization. And working class individuals. Now, we talked about how they had the possibility to move up, but we also talked about how they may stick with jobs that were demeaning and not very lucrative. So some working class individuals were probably not pleased with their new lives. They had 18-hour days sometimes, many times. They had low wages. The factory owners knew all these people wanted to work in factories, so they didn't have to pay them that much. They just had to pay them enough that they could get workers in the door. And if people were waiting in line to work there, you didn't have to pay them that much more. You could just pay them the bare minimum that they would come to work for. And dangerous machinery. These factories had people working in there, but they were also full of dangerous machines, and so that was something that you had to worry about on a daily basis if you are working in a factory. And They also, you have to think about who was working. Women and children also worked. So the men were going into these dangerous machinery-filled factories and working these 18-hour days for low wages. But women and children were doing the same thing, and they were often paid less than men. And they were also usually given the most menial jobs. So if they thought the men could lift stuff and they could figure stuff out better, then they would be given better jobs. The women and children may have been given jobs that were more along the lines of cleaning up after people, sweeping, washing dishes, sewing. They weren't going to be given the better jobs. They were going to be given worse jobs, harder jobs sometimes, and they were going to be paid less than men. So they're working in these same dangerous conditions a lot of the time, but being paid less. So while there were some benefits to people moving very quickly to the city, there were also some drawbacks as well. A small rebellion led by a group called the Luddites tried to resist industrialization and were known for vandalizing factory equipment. So they were one group who did not like this industrialization. They didn't like all the bad things they saw come with it, and they didn't like the social class changing, and they said, okay, we don't want all this industrialization. We want things to kind of stay how they were, but that didn't really work out. For the most part, people were optimistic about the prospect of upward mobility. They thought they might be able to move from a lower social class to a higher one. And they were willing to endure hardship for hope. So even though they were working these bad jobs for low pay, they had that hope, that option that they could advance, that they could make more money, that they could have better lives here in the city. So the Industrial Revolution was just whenever, all at once in the 19th century, very quickly energy sources came along that were new to people and increased productivity. And one of the big things was that the factory system came about, where each person would work on one step in the process and it would get things done quicker. That division of labor increased productivity. And with all of this, with the factory system, there was a rapid increase of population to cities throughout Europe.
In the early 1800s, the United States took control of a broad swath of territory in central North America. In the early 19th century, even though France was a major European continental power, it had land claims in North America. Now, the United States was very concerned about this because it was a young country in the early 1800s, and it had concerns about having to share that continent with another major strong European power, especially after battling Great Britain in a major war for their independence, the American Revolution. Also, American leaders at that time had the aspiration that one day the United States would stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, from sea to shining sea. So in 1803, the United States took advantage of an opportunity to purchase or acquire the Louisiana Territory from France. The United States government at that time, which was led by Thomas Jefferson, purchased the territory from Napoleon Bonaparte, ruler of France, for $15 million. The land area of the United States more than doubled with the purchase, which included all the land from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. This land was, and even today, full of fertile plains and vital waterways, and later became all or part of 13 states, which include Oklahoma, obviously, Louisiana, Missouri, Arkansas, Iowa, Minnesota, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming.
Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave who had been taken by his owner from Missouri, a slave state, and after they left Missouri, Dred Scott and his owner, he then traveled to Illinois, a free state, and then to the Minnesota Territory, considered free land based on the Missouri Compromise. Then he returned to Missouri. So Scott was actually with his family, which was his wife and 2 daughters, and they were traveling with his owner, who was a doctor in the United States Army. So the Army sent him to different places. He was in Missouri, then he got stationed in Illinois, then he was sent out to the Minnesota Territory, which meant that Scott and his family were taken into free states and into a free territory. And so some people thought he should be considered free now because he had been in free lands, which would have given him his freedom. Other people said no, he was still property of his owner, the doctor. And so there was some confusion on this, and there were lots of people on both sides of the debate. And this idea became more and more popular and more of an issue. So after his owner died, after they returned to Missouri, Scott and abolitionists who wanted to abolish slavery or get rid of it took his case to court, stating that Scott and his family were free after living in free territory. Now the case got passed up and up and up, and eventually it made it to the Supreme Court, which seriously tested the United States laws regarding slavery. So in the Missouri Compromise, Congress had come up with some certain laws that would be a compromise for both the slave states and the free states. And those laws, along with the other constitutional laws, all came into question with the Supreme Court when they had to decide this case. Was Dred Scott and were his family members free because they had traveled into free territory, or were they still considered slaves because they were still property of that owner? Well, the Supreme Court decided that as a slave, Scott was not a U.S. citizen. Therefore, he could not sue for freedom. So, since he wasn't a citizen, he couldn't sue for freedom. His time in free states did not change his status. So, the Supreme Court ruled that no, he and his family were not free. They were still considered slaves. They were passed to the doctor's wife, and whenever she remarried, they got passed off back to Dred Scott's first owner. And so he didn't get his freedom with this Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court said, no, you're not free. Even though you went in the free states, you were still property of that doctor, and the doctor shouldn't be deprived of his personal property because of where he travels. So that was how the Supreme Court was thinking. And since he wasn't a citizen himself, because he was of African descent, he couldn't sue for his own freedom. And finally, the Supreme Court decided that the Missouri Compromise was overturned as unconstitutional. So first and foremost, all laws and decisions need to be constitutional. They need to be in line with what the Constitution says. And the Supreme Court said, actually, the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. We're overturning it. the court said Congress had overstepped its bounds by outlawing slavery in the territories. This gave popular sovereignty to all states and territories, which meant that each state or territory got to decide for itself whether it was going to be a slave state or a free state or territory. And so the Missouri Compromise, trying to dictate which states would be free and which would be slave states or territories, the Supreme Court said that's unconstitutional. Each state should get to decide for itself. We're going to make sure popular sovereignty is very clear, and that's what we're going to go by. We're not going to go by the Missouri Compromise. And they also said Dred Scott and his family should still be slaves, and they should just be passed off like property as since his owner had died. And so this decision spurred public outrage, especially among the abolitionists who wanted Dred Scott to become free and were trying to abolish slavery. And it deepened tensions between the northern and southern states. So the northern states were primarily abolitionists, primarily free states. The southern states are primarily slave states. And so tensions between those two areas of one country grew even deeper because this case had made it clear that the North felt one way very decisively, and the South was still leaning towards slavery very heavily. And eventually it was going to be a bigger problem. Now, there is a happy ending for Dred Scott because while the Supreme Court did not decide that he was supposed to be free and that his family should be free, Dred Scott and his family got passed off to his owner who died's wife. The wife remarried. Her husband gave Dred Scott and his family back to his original owners, and that owner immediately set him free and emancipated him. So 3 months after this court decision, Dred Scott and his wife and 2 daughters did become free African American people. They still didn't count as citizens yet because anyone of African descent couldn't count as a citizen at this point in time. But they did become free people and could go live in the free states and make their own money and didn't belong to anyone. They weren't owned by anyone. So there was a happy ending for Dred Scott, but this case spurred more and more tension between the northern and southern states. The Egyptians. The Egyptians lived in a concentrated area along the lower parts of the Nile River around 3000 BC. And they were able to predict flooding and control irrigation, which made the Nile River Valley a very fertile area. And since they grew surplus crops, Egyptians had time to pursue other interests. So the Egyptians lived in the Nile River Valley, the lower part of the land along the lower part of the Nile River, and they could predict when floods would occur, and they also had control of irrigation techniques. So they were able to farm a lot of that land and grow enough crops that they had plenty to spare. They had some to store up for the future, for times of drought or famine, and they had time to do other things. So they were definitely a farming community, but they had lots of other interests because their civilization developed in a very fertile area that made for an easier life than some of the other civilizations that were developing around the same time period. So the Egyptians developed writing. They had that extra time. They developed a system of writing. They farmed minerals from the valley and surrounding desert. So they figured out what minerals they could use from the ground, and they would go and farm them as well, or mine them out, because they had all this extra time. So they farmed the land, but they also farmed the minerals. They developed a vast trading network. So they have all this extra food. They've got these minerals, they can write, they can make jewelry, pottery. They had a lot of art, and their art and architecture were modeled throughout other civilizations in the surrounding areas as the Egyptians developed more and more. So they had a vast trading network. They would trade very far away from where they lived, and people would come from far away to trade with them. They developed a military to defend against attacks. So you can imagine living in this fertile valley. Other civilizations are going to say, hey, that spot looks really great. I want to live there. I want our people to live there. So the Egyptians did have to defend Egypt against attacks because this Nile River Valley was a pretty popular place, and people saw that it was good land and they tried to make it their own. So Egypt had to develop a military. They formulated an effective system of medicine. So they were able to record symptoms and say, oh, this looks similar to when this other person was sick. This is what we gave them and it made it better. This person doesn't look like they're getting better. They may have this much time to live. This person has a wound. If we put this medicine and wrap it up, it will get better. So they had an effective system of medicine. They organized collective construction. In fact, one of the Egyptians' greatest achievements were their pyramids. And the pyramids were not something that just a few people could build. These took lots and lots of time and lots of manpower to build. So the pyramids are something that a lot of people associate with Egypt even today. And back then, remember I said that a lot of other people modeled the Egyptians' art and architecture. One of their architectural things that people wanted to copy were the pyramids. They were very impressive. Even now they're very impressive, but for them to be able to make it back then without all of the modern equipment that we have was very impressive. So pyramids were originally built as burial sites for pharaohs who were the leaders in Egypt, and they were believed to continue ruling in the afterlife. So they made these huge pyramids and they buried the pharaohs in there after they died, and they buried them with food and with servants and with animals, with gold, jewels. They wanted them to be entertained and fed and have plenty to drink and have plenty of people to wait on them in the afterlife as well. And so they buried all of this with them, thinking it would all go with the pharaoh to the next life. Peasants worked on the pyramids in exchange for food and shelter. So for people who maybe didn't have their own area of land, people who wanted these pyramids built would say, okay, you come build on the pyramid, we'll feed you and make sure you've got a place to live. The shape of the pyramids is meant to symbolize the slanting rays of the sun, and if you think about the way that the pyramids slant down, and the sloping sides were also thought to help the souls of the pharaohs climb to the sky to join the other gods. So slanting rays down from the sun, but also it slants up toward the sun from the ground, and so the pharaoh's soul was supposed to be assisted by those sloping sides. It could make its way up toward the sky to join the other gods. And just to give you an example of how much time and how much labor a pyramid might take, the largest pyramid from this time took around 20 years and around 100,000 laborers to complete. So if a pharaoh came into power, he better start getting his pyramid built really quickly, because by the time that it was done, it would be about the time he was going to be needing it. So the Egyptians were a very accomplished people. They were very ahead of their time, both in architecture and art, and they lived in the fertile Nile River Valley around 3000 BC. Geographical features. There are many commonly identified geographical features. Plateaus are elevated, but they are flat on top. Some plateaus are very dry, such as the Kenya Plateau, because surrounding mountains prevent them from receiving moisture, either in the form of rainfall or simply clouds and humidity being able to develop in that area. So some plateaus are very dry, but not all of them. All plateaus are going to be elevated areas that are flat on top. plateau, flat. Remember plat, flat, and that will help you remember. Plateaus are the flat areas, and that is what makes it a very specific geographical feature, is that they are flat on top. Deserts are another common geographical feature, and deserts receive less than 10 inches of rain per year. So that's what classifies an area as a desert. Where you may receive a couple of inches of rain overnight, a desert is only going to see 10 inches of rain or less per year. And they are usually large areas. You won't usually find a small area that's classified as a desert. It's usually going to be a really large area, such as the Sahara Desert in Africa or the Australian outback. Because if there's an area that's only receiving 10 inches of rain per year, it's usually going to be a geographic location that's spread out over a large area and then slowly transitions into areas with more rain. You usually won't find just one little spot. Deltas occur at river mouths. And because rivers carry sediment down to the delta, these areas are often very fertile. So deltas of rivers would be good areas to grow crops because lots of sediment with new, fresh nutrients would constantly be being transported down to that delta area. Mesas are flat, steep-sided mountains or hills. And this term is also sometimes used to refer to plateaus. So a mesa is different in that it's at the top of a steep-sided mountain or hill, where plateaus could be elevated, but they don't necessarily have to be at the top of a mountain or a hill. They could just be raised up and then go for a really long way without being the top of a mountain or a hill. It could just be a big break in elevation. Now, the term plateau can still be used for mesas because plateaus are flat areas of land. Basins are areas of low elevation where rivers drain. So you've heard of river basins probably, and where a river winds its course, the basin is the area that's kind of carved out by the river and that is a lower elevation than the surrounding land. Foothills are the transition area between the plains and the mountains, so flat lower lands and high mountains. And they are usually made up of hills that gradually increase in size as they get closer to the mountain range. So foothills, you have a flat plain, and then slowly you have higher and higher hills until you get to the mountain peaks. And last we have marshes and swamps. And these are also lowlands like your basin, but they are very wet and usually spread out, and they are largely covered in vegetation such as reeds and rushes. Where a river basin could still hold shrubbery and trees, marshes and swamps are going to be so saturated with water almost year-round so that the only things that can grow there are water plants such as reeds and rushes. Now there are other geographical features. We mentioned mountains, we mentioned rivers, we mentioned plains. All of those are geographical features. These are just some that you might not see as commonly, but they're still important for you to know. Popular sovereignty. In addition to the pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions that were present in the mid-1800s, a third group arose. They felt that each individual state should be allowed to decide whether to allow or ban slavery within its borders. And this idea was known as popular sovereignty. So each individual state would be allowed to decide if they were going to allow slavery or ban slavery, if they were going to be a slave state or a free state. And this was because there was a lot of pro-slavery and anti-slavery support going on, and the different groups were lobbying for different things to happen in Congress and with future laws, especially as this is a period where a lot of new states were joining the Union. It was right after the Mexican-American War, when the United States had gained a lot of land after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and so people were worried about what would happen in the future. And so the people who were somewhere in the middle of pro-slavery and anti-slavery decided that they should just leave it up to the individual states. The people who were living in these new areas that wanted to become states, they thought that they should get to decide whether that state was going to be a free state or a slave state. And that idea was known as popular sovereignty. So, when California applied to join the Union in 1849, the balance of congressional power was threatened again. During the Mexican-American War, there was a lot of worry in Congress about what would happen with all the new land. Would they be admitted as free states, or would they be admitted as slave states? And a lot of people said, oh, we don't want any more slave states, but the slave states didn't want there to only be free states, because then eventually they would be outnumbered and they wouldn't be able to get what they wanted done in Congress anymore. So with TExES, it was already done. And after the Mexican-American War, the United States had all this land, but it wasn't formed into states yet. So when California applied to join the Union as a state, it was going to have to decide whether to be a free state or a slave state, and all this turmoil came about again. The balance of power was threatened because California could be one or the other, and that was going to add a state to one side or the other. So, the Compromise of 1850 was drawn up, and it introduced a set of laws meant to end the conflict. So, these laws were compromises that both sides could agree upon. California was admitted as a free state, and the slave trade in Washington, D.C., where Congress met, was outlawed. So these were some concessions on the side of free states. California became a free state, slave trade in Washington, D.C. was outlawed, and efforts to capture escaped slaves were increased. So this is something that was going to tailor to the slave states. Slaves were escaping from the states where they were enslaved and traveling north, traveling to free states. And then once they got there, they were being allowed to be free, they were being protected, they were being fed, sheltered, helped to get further away from the slave states. And the slave states got in this compromise that efforts to capture and return those escaped slaves were going to be increased. So instead of people sheltering any escaped slaves, they were supposed to return them back to where they belonged, back to where their owners were. New Mexico and Utah would decide individually whether or not to allow slavery. So Mexico and Utah were given popular sovereignty. They were allowed to decide for themselves as a state, each one of them, whether they were going to allow or ban slavery. And even after the laws included in the compromise, fierce debate arose every time a new state planned to enter the Union. So they'd come up with some compromises, but every time a new state was going to enter the Union, there was going to be some worry. There was going to be a lot of debate because people didn't want either the free states or the slave states to gain too much power, to get too many states on their side. So there was always going to be that debate until finally, with the Civil War, slavery was banned forever. But popular sovereignty was simply part of the Compromise of 1850, which was enacted to help settle tensions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions. And popular sovereignty just meant that individual states would have the right to decide for themselves as a state whether to allow slavery or to ban slavery from that state. Reconstruction. There were a few different aspects to Reconstruction after the Civil War in the United States. First, we have presidential Reconstruction. And this has to do with what the president has control over. So presidential construction was largely driven by President Andrew Jackson's policies. Lincoln had not gotten to do too much with Reconstruction before his assassination. So the primary policies for presidential Reconstruction came from Andrew Jackson. And he was lenient on the South and allowed continued discrimination and control over blacks. So presidential Reconstruction really wasn't helping to reconstruct. President Andrew Jackson just quickly wanted to say, okay, everything's reconstructed, we can be one union again, everything's over, everything's good. But that wasn't really the case. Next, we have congressional Reconstruction. And this has to do with how Congress handled Reconstruction. Congress was controlled mainly by radical Republicans during this period. And they provided more civil rights for blacks and wanted more control over the Southern government. Basically, Congress wasn't ready to forgive and let the Southern governments go back to doing just what they'd been doing before. They were worried that the South would try to reinforce slavery or still keep African Americans in a lower condition or lower position than they were in. And they were right in a sense, because that did continue for a long time. The radical Republicans were just ones who were very seriously pro African Americans and anti-South. They wanted the South to be punished. They wanted to hold more control over the South to make sure they could be trusted before they were left on their own. So this was marked by military control of former Confederate state governments. So again, Congress that was made up of these radical Republicans were still worried about what the South might do if they were given free reign and could have their governments functioning however they wanted. So they have military control of these former Confederate state governments. And Congress was responsible for the Reconstruction Amendments, which were adopted from 1865 to 1870. Those were the 5 years directly following the Civil War. And so they worked to get these amendments passed. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution abolished slavery. So the Emancipation Proclamation had granted freedom to slaves in Confederate states that were rebelling against the Union, but it didn't free all slaves. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and freed all slaves. The 14th Amendment included the privileges and immunities, due process, and equal protection clauses. So it was giving them more civil rights, more rights as U.S. citizens. And the 15th Amendment granted voting rights regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So again, more civil rights, but specifically voting rights to all men, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This didn't give voting rights to women, only to men, and it could be for black or white men. And the promises of these amendments were worn away by state laws in the South and federal court decisions that upheld the state's laws and went against what these constitutional amendments were giving the new black citizens. So states passed what were known as the Jim Crow laws, which limited the rights of African Americans. And so it made it hard for them to be able to vote. It made it hard for them to have the same rights and privileges as white men did at that time. Now, they were free, but they were still pushed into a lower position than white people. They weren't treated the same way. They weren't given the equal treatment that they should have been given under these Reconstruction amendments. And then finally, the last part of Reconstruction is known as redemption, which presumes that the South was redeemed and had lived up to any conditions it needed to live up to and could now be accepted back into the Union. So the Confederate States were gradually readmitted to the Union. And white Democrats took over most Southern governments, and the last troops left the South in 1877. So this is considered the last year of Reconstruction because it was when redemption was achieved. The last Union troops that had military control over those former Confederate states, they left, they retreated, and went back to their homes up north. So no more troops were there to control the governments. White Democrats swept across and took over most of the Southern governments and continued to oppress new black citizens. And the Confederate States were gradually readmitted to the Union. So they were considered redeemed, allowed back in with all the rights that they had previously as states in the Union. Now, black citizens were still going to be discriminated against for the years to come until the 1960s, when they actually were given their full rights and people were forced to acknowledge those instead of just ignoring them. The Jim Crow laws were overturned and considered unconstitutional themselves during the 1960s. But during Reconstruction, the Reconstruction amendments were passed, giving the new black citizens more rights in name. They just didn't get them in act yet. And the Southern governments were slowly rebuilt until they were allowed to function on their own, and that was known as redemption, which ended the period known as Reconstruction. Manifest destiny. The phrase manifest destiny is used to mean the inevitability and righteousness of the American expansion westward. It meant that America was destined to stretch across the continent from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. So during the early 1800s, a lot of Americans felt this way. They felt that it was destiny for America to stretch across the continent from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, that it was destined for America to keep expanding and cover as much of North America as possible. Some believed that this was destined by God. Some just believed that it would be economically profitable, and so America should keep expanding. The phrase itself was coined by editor John O'Sullivan to promote the annexation of Texas and the Oregon Country. And the annexation would be if the United States annexed or took in Texas and the Oregon Country, if the United States made those part of America. And they would have to then either make them states or divide them up into states. The idea was lent further credence by the work of Horace Greeley, the journalist responsible for the admonition, "Go west, young man." Now, when Horace Greeley wrote this, he was saying, go west because in the west there is fertile land. You can go and make a life for yourself out there. as opposed to in the East, where the big cities had a lot of poverty and a lot of unemployment. So westward expansion was seen as the solution to that problem. If you went west and were willing to work hard, you could make a life for yourself, and you could have a much better life than you could living in the cities. So Manifest Destiny was coined by John O'Sullivan and was further promoted by Horace Greeley in his admonition, "Go west, young man." Now, besides this mythology of manifest destiny, there were some sound reasons why the United States expanded westward. There was cheap and fertile land in the West. The fertile farmland available in the United States proper, the area that had been divided by states and was well settled, that area was already claimed by people. So you would have to pay more money to get that farmland, and it would have already been used, so it may not be as fertile as it once was, where in the West there was land that hadn't been farmed yet. There was land that was cheap and fertile, and it could give you a good life if you were willing to go out there and work hard. In addition, the more land that was claimed by the Americans, the less there was that could be claimed by the British. So, even though the British wasn't supposed to be claiming any new land in the Americas, that was always a threat if there was land that had been unclaimed by any country. So if the Americans expanded westward and took over certain areas of land, that meant there was less land Britain could lay claim to. Americans also had an eye towards claiming western ports to begin trading with Asia. If they had ports along the western coast, they could sail straight across to Asia. They wouldn't have to go all the way across Europe to get to Asia, or just pay different amounts of money to the British, who could export goods from the Asian countries and then send them over to America. But Americans would be paying more money for that because they would have to travel further. If Americans could just have their own port cities, Asian countries could send their own ships over, sell their own goods to Americans directly, and Americans could also launch out of those western port cities and trade with the Asian countries. So the Americans did have an eye on getting western port cities built up. The fur trading industry, or fur trapping industry, made the Oregon country more appealing, and the discovery of gold in a California stream generated even more excitement over the economic potential of the West. So people realized that trapping animals for their fur and trading and selling those furs was becoming more lucrative, and there were a lot of animals to be trapped in this open Oregon country. And then in California, gold was discovered in a stream, and this led to even more excitement over the economic potential of the West. They realized that there was gold to be had there was farming to be had there was fur trapping to be had there was a lot of economic potential in the West, and so that gave another sound reason to why Americans wanted to expand westward. And finally, many Americans felt that they would only be benefiting the world by spreading their ideas of liberty and democracy across as much land as possible. So some countries, especially in South America, had already identified with the United States. They had already declared their own independence, they had formed their own small countries, and they wanted to try to have a democracy like America did. They wanted to be free, they wanted their liberty, their personal liberties, and so other countries were already following America as a model. So now the Americans felt that they would only be benefiting the world if they brought their values, their ideals of liberty and democracy to other areas of the world. So if they spread across as much land as possible, promoting these ideals or spreading them as they spread the United States, basically, as they made the United States larger and encompassing more land, those values would be spread to those areas because they would be a part of the United States as well. So manifest destiny is the term used to describe the inevitability and righteousness of American expansion westward, of the American expansion across the continent to spread from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. And it meant that this was going to happen, this was inevitable, and that the righteousness meant that it was destined to happen. This was a good thing. Many believed it was destined by God. Others believed it just should happen because of the economic potential there. The term was coined by John O'Sullivan to promote annexation of Texas and the Oregon Country. The idea was given further credence by Horace Greeley whenever he admonished people, "Go west, young man," spreading the ideals of the West, saying that you could have a good life out there as opposed to the poverty and unemployment found in a lot of large eastern cities. Besides these ideas of manifest destiny, there were actual sound reasons for America to extend westward. There was cheap and fertile land. The more land America claimed, the less the British could claim. Americans wanted western port cities so they could trade with Asia. They also realized that there were a lot of lucrative industries to be had in the West, such as fur trapping and gold mining, in addition to having fertile land for farming. And then Americans wanted to continue to spread their ideals of liberty and democracy to as many lands as possible. Marbury versus Madison. William Marbury was one of the Federalist judges removed from office by the Judiciary Act of 1802. After Thomas Jefferson became president after the election of 1800, he pushed through the Judiciary Act of 1802. Now, the Judiciary Act of 1801 had been passed with the intention of keeping Federalist judges in place after the election, but Thomas Jefferson passed an act a year later that removed 42 of those Federalist judges. So William Marbury was one of those Federalist judges that had been removed from his office. Marbury, having been promised a job, brought up the issue with James Madison, who was then Secretary of State, but James Madison pleaded ignorance. He said, "I don't know anything about this promise you received. I'm not going to honor it." Now the issue became contentious, and in 1803 came before the Supreme Court as Marbury versus Madison. Although Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789 had a writ of mandamus which required Madison to honor the appointment, Chief Justice John Marshall declared this section unconstitutional. So he declared Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional because he said that that was beyond the scope of the Constitution. It was inconsistent with what the Constitution actually gave Congress the power to do, and so the Supreme Court under John Marshall said that actually they didn't have to honor giving Marbury that job because what he was claiming he should get the job under was actually an unconstitutional part of the act. This was a historic act. Before now, the Supreme Court had not declared measures unconstitutional on a national level before. So, this was something that Congress had enacted. It wasn't something that was a state law or state situation that they had said, "Oh, that's unconstitutional. We're not going to have any of that." This is on a national level where the judicial branch was checking the legislative branch. So it was a very important event in the scope of the United States history because it was giving the judicial branch more power, or at least establishing that the judicial branch had that power. Since the three branches of government are supposed to have checks and balances on each other to make sure no one branch becomes too powerful, it was very important that the judicial branch was showing they had this power. Marshall established an independent judiciary with this case. He is quoted as saying, "The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, with the Supreme Court as the final interpreter." And that is pretty much how it goes. The Supreme Court gets to interpret the Constitution. If there's a part in there that's up for debate, then the Supreme Court can interpret it whichever way they think is most fair or most what the writers of the Constitution had in mind. So Marbury versus Madison was a very important case because it did establish that the judicial branch, in the form of the Supreme Court, could declare an act of Congress unconstitutional. So the judicial branch had that important check on the legislative branch. So this is very important in the scope of United States history.
We could define tornado as a violent rotating column of air, usually extending from a severe thunderstorm to contact Earth's surface on either land or water. Now, you generally think of a tornado as being on land, but you see in this case that it can be on water. Now, if a tornado is on water, you are probably not going to notice it, and it's not going to inflict near as much damage as if it was on land. But nevertheless, a tornado can be on land or water. In fact, tornadoes can occur almost anywhere in the world except for Antarctica. But the most common and dangerous ones in the United States are between the Appalachian Mountains in the east and the Rocky Mountains in the west, in an area called Tornado Alley. The states of Kansas and Oklahoma are both in the Tornado Alley, which are known for having lots of tornadoes. Now, the rotating column of air is invisible until a funnel forms from condensed water droplets or dust and debris from the ground, or maybe even a combination of the two. So a tornado in and of itself is invisible because it's just a rotating column of air. But that rotating column of air is going to pick up debris or water droplets, and that's how it becomes visible. Now, the extreme rotating wind speeds reduce pressure inside the funnel significantly. Now, because of the low pressure inside the funnel, the air molecules can expand because there's not as much pressure on them. But when the air molecules expand, they have to perform work to expand. So when they're performing work, they're using kinetic energy, and a type of energy is heat. So they're releasing this energy, which causes a release of heat, which causes the temperature to drop. And so the temperature drops until water vapor condenses into visible droplets. Now, we have a scale to measure the strength of a tornado. Of course, we could just look at the wind speed, but we have a scale called the Fujita scale, or we could call it the F scale, which is a way to measure the intensity of a tornado on a scale of 0 to 5. So if you ask how big a tornado was, instead of getting a wind speed, you'll just get a number from 0 to 5. And so this makes it easier just to get a general idea of how big a tornado was. And so starting out, an F0 tornado has wind speeds of 40 to 72 miles an hour. And so those types of tornadoes don't cause a lot of damage. But in some very violent F5 tornadoes can have wind speeds exceeding 310 miles an hour, and that can inflict some serious damage and loss of life. So that's a look at tornadoes.
The executive branch of the U.S. federal government is one of three branches. We have the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch. The executive gives the most familiar face to it because the executive branch is the office of the president. Now, where does the president live?
In the White House.
The president lives in the White House, and which is a very familiar icon, which looks something like that. We'll go ahead and label it. White House. And so you have this is the U.S. president, and underneath him would be the vice president. And then there are some appointments that the president gets to make. And there's a number of these. And what are these? What's the body of these appointments called? Where you have like the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. What are these called?
The cabinet.
These are the cabinet positions. And there are 15 different departments, ranging from Department of State, which is one of the oldest and most respected, all the way down to Department of Homeland Security, which is a more recent creation. And there are other officers that are appointed by the U.S. President that are at a cabinet level but are not considered to be one of the 15 departments that you typically think of with your cabinet officers. Now, the president is a very powerful position. It was the presidency was created and our system of government was created with the U.S. Constitution in 1787. And we had George Washington, who was our commander-in-chief at the time. And so when the Constitution was written, it was crafted where a man like George Washington, a very popular, powerful figure, would be in that office. And so the powers that were invested in the office were kind of tailor-made to someone like him. And so as a result, the United States has a very powerful presidency as compared to some other countries. What are some of the powers that the president has? I'd like to just list them.
Leader of the military?
He's the leader of our armed forces. He's our commander-in-chief. And he's the guy that the generals ultimately report to, and he makes a lot of the decisions about our armed forces and how they're going to be deployed. And our Joint Chiefs of Staff, they look to the president for their marching orders. While Congress declares war, the president is the one that takes us to war and leads our troops. What else? What are some other responsibilities?
He listens to Congress?
When the bills come from Congress, Congress is responsible for making the laws. And so they have to get through the Senate, they have to get through the House of Representatives, but then they come before the president, and the president has the right to either sign them into law or to veto them. And this is part of the balance of powers, where Congress is very powerful, they can make the laws, but the president can veto them if he doesn't like them. Now, then it goes back to Congress, and Congress can overturn the president's veto with a 2/3 vote, but that's often very difficult for them to achieve. And so the president has veto power over a lot of legislation that comes through. The president usually doesn't do it that often, but it is a very powerful tool in the tool belt to use, and you can help influence Congress to pass certain legislation. You can threaten them not to pass other legislation, and by the threat of the veto. What else?
Spending?
Spending. Through the cabinet positions, the budget is set by Congress, but the president has a lot of influence in that process, and through the cabinets, a lot of money goes into the cabinets, positions and departments, and gets spent through there. And so there is some involvement with spending through the presidency. What else?
Can he declare states of emergency, like storms? Or?
Yes. Whenever there's a hurricane or a tornado or some other natural disaster that moves to the area, the president can authorize a FEMA, an emergency response, to go to that area to pour in relief funds and help out. So help declaring states of emergencies. What else?
Makes executive agreements?
Yes. part of Congress's responsibilities is to approve treaties, but the president is the one that makes the initial negotiations. When you think about it, a foreign power, we're dealing with a foreign power as the United States. The president is the one that sits down across the table from a foreign leader and tries to hammer out the details of this is what our treaty should be. Then he has to bring that treaty back and get it approved by Congress. And so again, we see the balance of powers, how each is involved in different processes to contribute to a positive result. What else?
Appoints people to different branches.
Appointments. A lot of federal judges are appointed by the current president. And as judges, either they die or they retire, and the U.S. president is the one that makes those appointments. And it's not just at the Supreme Court level, it's at other levels of the judiciary. It's through the cabinet departments. The president has a huge impact with appointments. Now again, this power is tempered through the through the legislative branch, which has the authority to deny some of the appointments. And so you can sometimes see a conflict between Congress and the president, where the president wants to appoint a certain person, but Congress says, no, you can't, come to us with a different name. What else?
Doesn't he grant pardons to criminals?
Pardons. This is a controversial use of presidential power at times, but as a way for the executive branch to have a check to the power of the judiciary. If someone is sentenced for a crime and the president feels that they didn't get proper treatment or something should be done, the president is a measure of last resort and can step in and can issue a pardon to a person that absolves them of the crime and can free them of their sentence. And so, but a lot of times people may feel that that was unwisely used, and so that's why it can be a controversial power. But as you can see, there are a lot of things. Usually we see the president on TV and we may not be sure exactly what he does, but he has a lot of different responsibilities. It's a very powerful position, and the president is the head of the executive branch.
Human geography is the study of people and their cultures throughout the world. It is a social science because it differs from other forms of geography. While most geographical studies are focused with the physical attributes of the land, human geography is focused with the people themselves and their culture. It has been an ancient practice to study human geography. In fact, there was a Greek geographer and historian who reported both things about the people and the land in which they lived. However, the idea and concept of human geography did not really start to catch on until the 18th and 19th centuries. The Royal Geographical Society was started in the 1800s by the UK, but it did not really start to take action until the 1900s. However, the National Geographic Society of the US was founded in 1888, started to publish a magazine about geography, and that magazine is still published today. The National Geographic Society is still active in other ways, promoting geographical research and education. So that's a brief look at human geography, what it is, and its development throughout the years.
The judicial branch of the U.S. federal government is one of the three branches. You have the legislative, which is Congress, you have the executive branch, which is the president, and then you have the judicial branch, which is our system of courts. And the highest court in our land is which court?
The Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court. And where does the Supreme Court meet?
In Washington, D.C.
In the Supreme Court building. It was a trick question. Okay. And they have a bunch of steps out in front, and it looks something like this. See, we'll get a roof there. Keep the rain off their heads. How many Supreme Court justices are there? There's 9. 9 Supreme Court justices. And who appoints them?
The president?
The president. The president makes the nominations, and then Congress has to vote to approve them. And how long do they serve? How long do Supreme Court justices and all federal judges serve?
Don't they serve for life?
They do. They serve for life. So they can choose to retire, and a lot of times they'll choose to retire at a time when a president of the same party that appointed them is in power to kind of preserve the balance of power, if you will, between parties on the Supreme Court. And sometimes they may die in office, in which case the current president would appoint them. Now, aside from the Supreme Court, below that, there are courts of appeals. And there's one court of appeals for each judicial circuit in the country. Now, how many of those are there?
13?
There are 13. So there's 13 courts of appeal that feed cases into the Supreme Court. Now, underneath Court of Appeals, the lower level, are district courts. And how many district courts are there in the country?
Like 94?
94. Very good. There's 94 district courts. And so cases that are heard at this level, some of them are appealed to this level, and some of those are appealed to this level. Now, how many cases do you think the Supreme Court are put to the Supreme Court, and where the Supreme Court is asked to hear these cases in a year? How many laws?
Couple hundred?
4,500 are presented to the Supreme Court, but they don't hear 4,500. They only hear about 200 a year. And so there aren't that many cases that are heard by the Supreme Court relative to the demand, but they choose cases that are benchmark cases that would kind of explain possibly a controversial area of law, and each of their verdicts is closely watched because it trickled down and affects opinions at all of the different levels. Now, when you think of the judicial branch, you think, well, what do they do? Because Congress makes the law, the president enforces the law. What the judiciary does is they explain the laws, okay, or they interpret the laws. And the way they do that is they make judgments. And so Congress will make a law, and it'll be applied to a certain situation. But you may have lawyers or businesses or two people on different sides that think that this law should be interpreted a different way. Well, who's to decide? If you have a law that says something should be done, but it doesn't quite define how it should be done, or who should do it, or how much they should do it, or when they've done it enough, who makes that decision? So what happens is a lawsuit gets filed between two parties, and it's taken before a district court judge. And they hear out the matter, and they decide through their understanding, their interpretation of the Constitution, through looking at other laws that have already been passed and judgments that have been rendered, and they make a decision on how the law that Congress passed should be interpreted. And that settles things. Now, one of the things they can do, one of the early powers that is very important that the U.S. Supreme Court kind of took upon itself, it's not spelled out explicitly in the Constitution, is the power of judicial review. Okay? And this is a very important concept and one of the most important terms that you should remember when it comes to the judiciary and the judicial branch. Judicial review is the power of the courts to determine if a law is unconstitutional. So if Congress can pass a law, but the Supreme Court in particular can look at that law and say, this law violates the U.S. Constitution. And the U.S. Constitution is the highest law of the land. And so when you have two laws in conflict, which one prevails? The Constitution prevails. And the Supreme Court is there to make sure that Congress doesn't pass laws that are unconstitutional. And if there's a question of, is this law constitutional, the Supreme Court makes the decision. And effectively, whatever they decide is supposed to be the correct answer on the constitutionality of a given law. And this is a very important power. It helps curb the power of the legislative branch to make laws. And so if Congress goes out there and makes just a wild, crazy law, the court system can rein that in and keep it from taking over and dominating our constitutional system that we have. And so it's an important part of the three branches. It's to protect our liberties and make sure that Congress or the President don't trample roughshod over them. Some of the judgments can be controversial, and people can say that a judge abuses their power. But the intent of the Constitution was to divide the powers and to make it where each side had a different strength and it would be balanced across the board. And so this is the Judicial Branch, and they explain the laws that Congress makes.
The Progressive Era started in the 1890s and ran through the 1920s. During this time period, the Progressives wanted to eliminate government corruption. They believed they could do this by eliminating political machines and political bosses. One way they wanted to accomplish this was through prohibition. They believed that those political bosses who operated through saloons could no longer be financed if prohibition came about. In addition, they were in favor of women's suffrage, the right for all women to vote, and in modernization. They believed that in all areas of society, old was bad because it was probably inefficient. So they were always searching for a new way to do things that they thought that would be more efficient. One way in which they tried to do this was by mimicking what was going on in Western Europe. They followed new advances in Western Europe very closely because they believed that what was going on over there was good and efficient. One example of this is the Federal Reserve System, an idea that America got from Europe. Followers of the progressive movement were mainly middle-class Americans, and it started in the local arena. Then the progressive movement moved to the state level, and then finally ended up in the national arena. They believed in scientific approaches to many things, including theology, school, and family life, as well as government. And so it was kind of a new thought at this time, and just as the name implies, they were progressive, looking for new ways to do things. The Reconstruction Era, also known as Reconstruction, was the time period after the Civil War until 1877. During this time period, the U.S. started to adjust to the changes as slaves were freed. This started with Abraham Lincoln, who was president immediately after the Civil War ended, and ran through President Rutherford B. Hayes. During this time, slaves were freed through the ratification of the 13th Amendment. In addition, former slaves and African Americans in general were empowered through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which all gave African Americans freedom. So this started under Lincoln, and he proposed a really moderate approach, as well as his vice president, who then became president, Andrew Johnson, did. They wanted a moderate approach to putting the U.S. back into a normal flow of things. But instead, radical Republicans began wanting a more harsh approach by punishing those who had fought in defense of slavery and giving freedmen as much power as possible to help them become level with the whites. It ended in 1877, however, as Democrats started coming to power and trying to go against what the radical Republicans had been doing and trying to repeal those acts. The Renaissance was a time of cultural transformations and advances in many areas of study. It was thought to have begun in Florence, Italy in the late Middle Ages. So I want to highlight a few of the areas that significant advances were made in during the Renaissance. One area was science, in which scientists began to understand the value of observation in making scientific discoveries. Also, advances were made in education. These reforms were somewhat slow, but people began to favor a more classical education. Advances were also made in politics, especially in the art of diplomacy. And then finally, art. Lots of advances were made in art, and that's why I left it for last, because it's considered the most important part of the Renaissance, or at least the most well-known. Painters at this time began to portray a more natural reality in their painting. Great painters at this time were Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, who both contributed greatly to the artistic advances during this time period. A term that came out of the Renaissance was the term Renaissance man, who is someone who has expertise in several areas of study. So if someone had expertise in science, education, politics, and art, we would refer to them as Renaissance men. And in fact, Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo were perhaps the first Renaissance men, and it's then an example of what a Renaissance man would be like. Printing at this time and advances in printing really were essential in helping bring about the Renaissance. This time, paper became more available, and the invention of metal movable type happened during this time period. And without those two things, the ideas that came out of the Renaissance could not be spread easily to other areas. So the advances in printing are essentially what helped spur on the Renaissance as it moved to different areas away from Florence, Italy. Today, historians debate the role of the Renaissance. Some historians believe that it was not as significant as others make it out to be, but the most confirmed resources that we have say that the Renaissance was a very important time following the late Middle Ages. The 19th century was an exciting time for the world, as many new changes and transformations came about. Now remember, when we're talking about the 19th century, we're not talking about the 1900s. We're talking about the 1800s. During this time, many empires collapsed, allowing many new empires to form, like the British Empire and America. And many advances in numerous fields came about, like in medicine. New inventions came about. New sports were invented and previous ones were developed further. The Industrial Revolution came about, and railroads were first put into use, which is interesting because that helped start urbanization, which was the practice of people coming from rural areas to urban areas, making many cities throughout the world have over 1 million inhabitants. In fact, London, which was the capital of the British Empire, started out at the beginning of the century with 1 million residents, and by the end of the century had almost 7 million residents, just in the course of about 100 years. Also, further geographical discovery happened all throughout the world. The interior of Asia and Africa, which previously had not been discovered or explored very much, was explored even more, and by the end of the 19th century you could look at a map and almost every area of the world had been discovered and a map had been made of it. Also, slavery came to an end in America after the ratification of the 13th Amendment following the Civil War, as well as coming to an end in Britain and Brazil, and serfdom, a similar practice, ended in Russia. So remember, when you think about the 19th century, think about many changes that came about, the collapse of empires, the forming of new ones, railroads coming about, urbanization. A lot of the world we lived in today was shaped by and the Middle Ages was a time period between the 5th and 15th centuries. It started at the collapse of the Roman Empire. Now we can split the Middle Ages up into 3 main sections: the early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, and the Late Middle Ages. And each section has its own particular characteristics. The early Middle Ages were characterized by social and political changes. Remember, the Roman Empire had just collapsed, so there was kind of a lot of land up for grabs at that point for countries to take that the Roman Empire used to hold. So a lot of conflict at that time as countries tried to gain and acquire that land for themselves. During the High Middle Ages, lots of population growth in Europe, lots of technological advances also in Europe. The Crusades took place at this point as Western Christians tried to regain the Holy Land from the Muslims. Also, feudalism was very common at this time, which is where a peasant would live on a piece of land owned by a noble in exchange for working for that noble. The late Middle Ages were a very depressing point of the Middle Ages. The Black Death occurred at that point, which was a disease that killed millions and millions of Europeans. There was also controversy in the church and some cases of heresy. Now, just like the Middle Ages came after the Roman Empire, the Renaissance came after the Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages in some ways set the stage for the Renaissance. World War I was the 6th largest conflict in history. It started in 1914 and ended in 1918, and all of the fighting took place in Europe. At that time, Austria-Hungary was at odds with countries around it. So when someone assassinated the Archduke of Austria, the war began. Austria-Hungary then invaded Serbia, and Germany invaded Belgium and Luxembourg. Previously agreed on alliances escalated the war very quickly, because when one country joined the war, another country would have to join a war with it because they were in an alliance. The two sides of the war were the Allies and the Central Powers. The countries among the Allies were the United Kingdom, France, and Russia, and the countries among the Central Powers were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. There were many other smaller countries involved, and other countries got involved in the war as the war progressed, as was the case with the United States, who eventually joined the side of the Allies. They helped bring about an end to the war by forcing Germany to surrender on what is now known as Armistice Day. Now, an armistice does not mean that the war is over. It just means that fighting has ceased. So the Allies signed an individual treaty with each country of the Central Powers to bring about an end to the war. The most well-known treaty is the Treaty of Versailles that the Allies signed with Germany. The Allies punished Germany for helping bring about a start to the war, and resentment caused by the Treaty of Versailles helped start World War II. The League of Nations also came about after World War I. It was a precursor to the United Nations, which exists today, and it was a council of nations to try to keep another war from happening. So that is a brief look at World War I. World War II was the largest military conflict in U.S. history. World War II was an extremely complex event with much more to talk about than we have time to right now. But I do want to highlight a few main points about World War II that you should know. First of all, it started in 1939 and ended in 1945. Now, when talking about the war in the context of the U.S. did not enter the war until 1941. World War II was essentially the Allied powers versus the Axis powers. So instead of just two countries fighting against each other, it was groups of countries fighting against another groups of countries who were joined together by treaties. The Allied powers were primarily made up of the U.S., the Soviet Union, Britain, and France, whereas the Axis powers were primarily Italy, Germany, and Japan. So there were many more smaller countries on both sides of the conflict, but those were the main countries that had the largest influence in the war. Essentially, what happened is Japan wanted to become a large power in East Asia. So it was already at war over there prior to 1939. Now, Germany started to invade Poland, and then France and Britain declared war on Germany. Basically, Adolf Hitler, the leader of Germany, wanted to increase the size of Germany by conquering other countries around it and making those countries part of Germany. In addition, the Holocaust refers to the harsh treatment of Jews and other political enemies of Adolf Hitler. Different political enemies were put into concentration camps where they were treated extremely poorly, and many of them died. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history. Over 100 million people were involved in it, so as you can imagine, millions and millions of people died from the conflict. It was interesting because during World War II, countries weren't involved in a war and involved in domestic things. All of their domestic resources were put into the war. Their scientific resources, their manufacturing resources, all were put into trying to win the war. World War II is the only time in a war that nuclear warfare has been put into place. What happened in 1941 is Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, a port in Hawaii of the U.S. So that's when the U.S. started joining the war in 1941. So to help bring about the end of the war, in what is known as D-Day, Allied forces invaded the beach on Germany and eventually conquered Berlin, and Germany had an unconditional surrender that helped bring about the end of the war in Germany. But since it was a world war and it was taking place all throughout the world, simply conquering and capturing Berlin was not enough to bring an end to the conflict. Japan was still alive and well during that time. So by the U.S. dropping 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan, the U.S. was helped to bring about Japan's surrender. Now, when World War II was over, world powers did not want to see another war like this come about. So the United Nations was created with larger countries and more influential countries in the world having a larger say in the dealings of the United Nations. Also, the Cold War, which came later after World War II, came about because of World War II. World War II basically set the stage for the Cold War because since the Soviet Union and the U.S. were both on the Allied side, they both came out of the war as winners and were superpowers. And so the two superpowers kind of faced off in the Cold War, which was to come after World War II.
The Articles of Confederation. After the Revolutionary War, the Articles of Confederation represented the first attempt of the newly independent colonies to establish the basics of independent government. So the colonists had been living under British rule, and they had different governors in each colony that kind of handled things, but they hadn't had to come up with their own government yet. So the Articles of Confederation was the colonists' first attempt at coming up with a basic rule of government now that they were a newly independent nation. The Continental Congress which was the same group that drafted the Declaration of Independence, passed the Articles on November 15, 1777, and they went into effect on March 1, 1781, following ratification or approval by all 13 states. So note that it took 3.5 years to actually be ratified by all 13 states. The Articles made the 13 colonies into states now. Each state had its own power, and then there was a central government, but it was a very weak central government. They didn't want to give too much power to the central government, but instead gave more power to the individual states. Now, after 3.5 years, everyone had finally signed off on it, they'd approved it, and the United States was going to be running its government based on the Articles of Confederation. The Articles prevented a central government from gaining too much power. Instead, power was given to a congressional body made up of delegates from all 13 states. But the individual states still retained final authority. So it made sense that the colonists, the new Americans, didn't want a strong central government. They had been being ruled by King George over in England, and they had felt like he was a tyrant. They didn't want one person to have that much power. They wanted to retain more power for the individual states that they came from. So they really tried to limit how much power a central government would have. They made up this congressional body, which would be made up of delegates from all of the states. So each state would have a voice in deciding what went on. The congressional body could come to a decision, but all of the individual states retained final authority. So even if the congressional body came up with something new that everyone was supposed to do, the states could say, no, we don't think we're going to do that here in New York or here in Maine. They could say they didn't want to have whatever it was going on in their state. They only wanted it to happen in other states, if at all. So even though the congressional body met and delegates came to it, the states didn't actually have to follow whatever laws came out of those discussions. However, without a strong central executive, this weak alliance among the new states proved ineffective at settling disputes or enforcing laws. So the Articles of Confederation and this group of United States, that's what it was, a weak alliance. Each state felt like it had its own autonomy, that it should be in charge of what went on within that state. Previously, these were known as colonies, and people in that colony felt like they should be able to control what went on there. So now people felt like they should be able to control what goes on in their state. So it was a weak alliance among the 13 states that was happening right now. There wasn't something strong uniting all of them together. In fact, most of the states were doing what they wanted to do. They didn't follow a central executive. So without this, the government was very ineffective in settling disputes or enforcing laws. And these are some of the problems that came up under the Articles of Confederation. Congress had great difficulty passing any legislation. And this was because a bill had to receive 9 of 13 votes to be made into a law. And there were often fewer than 10 representatives present. So even though the legislation wouldn't necessarily be binding on every state if a state chose to ignore it, Congress had difficulty even passing legislation because they could present a bill and say, we want to pass this into a law. Well, if you only had 8 people there, it wasn't happening because you needed 9 of the 13 states to vote and say yes to making that bill into a law. If you had 9 people there and it wasn't unanimous, you weren't getting your law. And if you had more than that, you still had to have at least 9 of the people say, or at least 9 of the representatives from the states say that they agreed they wanted to pass the law. So it's very difficult for any legislation to actually get passed, to even think about having it in effect in a state. The lack of a central court system made it hard to resolve disputes between citizens from different states or between the states themselves. So if you had 2 citizens that were traveling and they got into some kind of an altercation, or they were trading but not within a specific state's boundary, then there wasn't really any kind of court system in place to resolve this. A person from one state will want to be tried in their state, a person from the other state will want to be tried in their state, and they would think that if they were in the opposite person's state, it wouldn't be a fair trial for them. There wasn't a court system in place to resolve any kind of conflicts like that between citizens that came from different states or between the states themselves. If there was any issue about a state's boundary line or who controlled which piece of property or anything like that that the states may argue about among themselves, there was no court system in place to resolve those issues because there was no strong central government. There was also not a central court system to rule over all the states together. The United States found itself deeply in debt. Remember, this is soon after the Revolutionary War. There were a lot of debts to be paid, and there was a lot of money that went into paying for troops, for food for the troops, paying for clothing, actually getting them transported. So the United States had spent a lot of money to actually win the Revolutionary War, and now it was in debt. But Congress did not have the power to tax the people directly and could only request funds. So one of the big problems that they had with King George, with England, was that they felt like they were getting taxed and it wasn't fair. They were getting taxed, but they didn't have representation. They were getting taxed on things very heavily that they felt they shouldn't be taxed on. So taxes were a hot button issue at this point. So the United States Congress could not enforce any kind of taxes. They couldn't make the people pay taxes. They could request funds from the states, but the states are trying to get themselves up and running. So they're not going to be making any big donations to the central government when they're still trying to help themselves, especially not if it's not required. If they're just being asked, they can say, oh, no, thank you, sorry, we don't have the money right now. Where if it was required, they would have to do it. So there wasn't a steady flow of money coming into the United States Congress or into the United States central government. So that was a problem. There was no way for there to be money flowing for the United States to function with. Furthermore, though Congress could issue currency, so it could issue money, it had the power to create money and give it out, it had no authority to keep the states from issuing their own. So we keep talking about how the states have a lot of power. Well, the states could print their own money. They could say, oh, we're going to use the Virginia dollar. So if they used the Virginia dollar, they didn't have to pay attention to any kind of U.S. currency, and there was a lot of inflation and deflation going on at this time because there was no single currency that everyone was using. If you tried to go from one state to the other, you may not have a valid form of currency, or what you have may be worth very little compared to the currency in that state. So that was a problem. So the Congress could give out money. They could say, here is the money we're going to use. This is the United States currency. But there was nothing to stop the states from making their own. So each state, for the most part, was printing its own currency as well. And this was making things even worse economically. Congress did not have the authority to raise an army directly. Again, it could only ask for troops. So it could request troops from the states. It could say each state needs to send 200 men to this place at this time or on this day. But it didn't actually happen. A lot of the states were going to be using the men that they had. Many men had been killed during the Revolutionary War. They weren't going to send the ones that they had somewhere else whenever they were needed to do the work within a state. Also, any states that were on the border where Native Americans might be were going to need their men to protect them there. They weren't going to want to send them to go be part of the United States Army. And since Congress couldn't require it, they couldn't say, you have to send these people. It was just, could you please send these people? Most of the time the state said, I'm sorry, we can't spare the troops, and no one was sent. Congress did not have the power to regulate interstate or foreign commerce. So any kind of trade that went on between states within the United States or between one state in the United States and another country couldn't be regulated by the United States Congress. Each state could come up with its own rules and regulations. Each state had different tariffs and trade regulations. And no foreign countries would enter into trade agreements with a nation so disorganized. And that makes sense. If you were a country that was economically stable, that had been around for a while, you wouldn't want to trade with the many different states in the United States. If you tried to trade with Virginia and they were going to charge you $5 to sell a certain product, and then you went down the coast and you went to South Carolina, then they wanted to make you pay $10 for the same product. It wouldn't make sense to you because they're all supposed to be from the same country. So most of the foreign countries weren't going to enter into any kind of trade agreements with states from the United States because it wasn't with one country. You would be making agreements with 13 different states, and that just wasn't practical for these foreign countries. Since Congress couldn't regulate any of that kind of trade between the states themselves or between the states and other countries, it was very disorganized. So these are some of the main problems that came up under the Articles of Confederation. And basically, the Articles of Confederation left America unable to maintain order at home. They couldn't keep things organized. They couldn't really enforce laws between states. They couldn't pass any new laws. They couldn't get any money in. They couldn't get any troops to help enforce anything or protect the borders outside of individual states. And they couldn't control trade. So there was a lot of disorganization. They couldn't maintain order at home. They were unable to gain respect abroad. They were the first colony or group of colonies to separate from the mother country and fight a war with that mother country and win. They were the first group to successfully break off from the country that colonized them. So that was a great step forward. But now they look like a joke because they aren't able to maintain any order at home. Everything's very disorganized. All the countries in Europe are looking over and saying, wow, we don't even want to do business with them. They're free, but look what happens when they break away from England. Now everything's crazy. So they weren't looking real good to the rest of the world, and they weren't able to gain respect abroad. And they were unable to improve, or America was unable to improve its economy. So as a whole country, it couldn't improve its economy if it couldn't do any kind of trading, and it looked like a joke to other nations. So it was not in a very good place under the Articles of Confederation. The idea of a weak central government needed to be revised. And recognition of these weaknesses that we discussed eventually led to the drafting of a new document, the United States Constitution. So the Articles of Confederation was filled with problems for America because it gave all the power to the states and very little to a central government. Without a central government to actually unite the states under laws that applied to all of them and court systems that could regulate all of them, trade regulations that could help all of them, things weren't going very smoothly. So in the end, the Articles of Confederation ended up being a list of what not to do whenever the United States drafted the Constitution. The Missouri Compromise. In 1820, the territory called Missouri asked to enter the Union as a slave state. This would have made the number of slave states 12 compared to 11 free states. So at this time in the United States, a state was considered either a free state or a slave state. If the state allowed slavery, it was a slave state. If the state did not allow slavery, then it was a free state. So most of your free states were going to be up north, and most of your slave states are going to be down in the south because slavery was more prevalent in the south. Now, in 1820, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states, so there were an even number for each side of this issue. So if Missouri had entered as another slave state, this would have given the slave states the upper hand when it came to voting for different things in Congress. There would be more people in favor of slavery than there were in favor of not having slavery, in favor of being a free state. So, rather than allow this to happen, James Talmadge proposed abolishing slavery in Missouri. So he said, okay, how about we just make Missouri a free state? If we make Missouri abolish slavery, Missouri enters as a free state, how about that? Well, that wouldn't have been a great solution for everyone because then there would have been 12 free states and only 11 slave states, so someone's still getting slighted there. So Henry Clay then offered another solution known as the Missouri Compromise. According to this proposal, Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state, but Maine would separate from Massachusetts and become a free state. So Massachusetts was already a free state. Maine at this time was part of Massachusetts. So in Henry Clay's compromise, Maine separated and became its own state, and it would enter as a free state. Missouri would enter as a slave state as it wanted, and that would change the number of both free states and slave states to 12. You'd have one of each being added, and so that was the compromise. It kept the number even. Each group would have the same number of states on the issue of slavery, but Missouri could still enter as a slave state as it had wanted to. Furthermore, everything south of Missouri would be slave territory, and everything above would be free. So the Missouri Compromise also lined out something for the future. In the future, anything south of Missouri would be considered slave territory, so if a state was to enter the Union from that area, it would be considered a slave state, and anything above Missouri would be free. So any states entering from above Missouri, any new states entering the Union would be free states. And this pretty much set a precedent as states were added that there would generally be one slave state added for one free state. They wouldn't allow just one or the other to join because then that would upset the balance in Congress. So they wanted to keep things even, and the Missouri Compromise kind of set the stage for that. Now this compromise was satisfactory to pretty much everybody for several reasons, even though the proposed free lands were larger than slave lands. So you might think some would have a problem with this, especially because the proposed free lands north of Missouri were larger than the slave lands south of Missouri. But people had their reasons for being okay with this compromise. This was because most agreed that slavery could not be successful in colder climates. So if you move up north, it gets colder. And people thought, you know what, slavery's not going to be successful up north anyway, so it's okay if everything north of Missouri is going to be a free state, because slavery wouldn't work there very well anyway. Most of the slaves are working on large plantations. Large plantations aren't going to be able to grow for as many months out of the year further north where it's colder. So this wasn't really something that was going to work as well up north, so they were fine with that area being free. Additionally, many thought that Texas would soon be a part of the United States. Texas was a very large area of land, and it would mostly be south of Missouri. So people thought, okay, Texas will join the Union soon, and then we'll have all that land in an additional state or multiple states that will be considered slave states, more slave territory. So everyone was okay with this because slavery wasn't going to work as well up north anyway, and the South thought, okay, we'll be getting more land soon anyway, so it doesn't matter if right now the free lands are larger than the slave lands. So the Missouri Compromise was a solution that Henry Clay came up with in response to Missouri's request to join the Union as a slave state, which would have offset the balance and made the United States have 12 slave states to 11 free states. The compromise included Missouri getting to enter as a slave state at the same time that Maine separated from Massachusetts and became a free state. And it also clarified for the future that anything south of Missouri would be slave territory and anything north of Missouri would be free territory. The Monroe Doctrine. After a series of revolutions in Latin America, the United States was the first to recognize the sovereignty of the new countries. And this was because the revolutionaries had used the United States as inspiration. The United States preferred to have weak, independent nations nearby, and the United States wanted to maintain and expand its lucrative trade with Latin America. So the United States was quick to recognize the independence of these new nations for several reasons. The United States liked that these revolutionaries had used them as a model. They'd used them as inspiration to declare their own independence and become sovereign nations. The United States preferred to have weak, independent nations nearby. If they didn't have colonies of strong foreign powers, that was better for the United States. So they liked having these independent countries that were smaller and weaker than themselves because they posed less of a risk. The United States wanted to maintain and expand its lucrative trade in Latin America. The United States enjoyed trading with Latin America. They enjoyed trading with these new countries even more because the foreign European powers that had colonized these areas had higher tax rates and controlled the market much more severely than the Latin American countries that were newly independent did. So trade conditions were better with these new independent countries in Latin America. After the United States recognized the sovereignties of these countries, the British attempted to persuade the United States to sign a joint agreement preventing foreign intervention in Latin America, but President James Monroe decided to maintain American independence and issue his own document. So the British also liked the better trade arrangements they were getting now that the Spanish and French were not controlling the market through their colonies. Now that these nations were independent, they made up their own trade rules, and they were better for the British as well. So the British also didn't want foreign intervention. The British didn't want anyone to come in and reclaim these areas as colonies of European powers because that would be worse for British trade relations. So Britain said, hey, America, I'll team up with you. Let's sign this joint agreement saying we'll make sure no one interferes. But James Monroe decided to maintain American independence and issue his own document. He didn't want a joint document with Britain. He said this is the United States policy. Didn't involve Britain. This document, known as the Monroe Doctrine, had as its two main principles non-intervention and non-colonization. So first, non-intervention meant that no foreign power could interfere with affairs in the Americas. So this meant that the Americas were kind of in their own sphere of influence now, and none of the European powers could come into that sphere of influence and try to interfere. So this said, you know what? All these countries are independent now. Europe doesn't have a handhold over here, so all these nations have been recognized as independent. If you try to interfere in any of them, then that'll be a problem. The United States wasn't going to like that and would intervene with military measures. Non-colonizations meant that the Americas, North and South America, that sphere of influence, were closed to further colonization. So any area that was as yet unclaimed or up in the air about who owned it, it wasn't open for more colonization. The Americas were now closed for colonization. So if anyone tried to interfere in the foreign affairs in Latin America or North America, or tried to colonize these areas, then America would intervene. That was basically what the Monroe Doctrine was saying. James Monroe didn't want any foreign powers to come in and try to interfere with the affairs or take over any of their old colonies. Many consider the Monroe Doctrine to be a paper tiger. Because it was really only as effective as the American ability to enforce it. So, called a paper tiger because it's fierce, but it's only written on paper. It's a good threat, but how do you really follow through on that? And so, since the American military wasn't very developed at this point in time, many considered this to be a paper tiger and not actually a serious threat. But it did seem to encourage foreign nations to come to the bargaining table rather than test the American military. This wasn't too long after the War of 1812. The Americans didn't do too badly in that. They were able to hold their own against Britain, and so people had seen that the American military was a force to be reckoned with, but they weren't sure how strong it was. And so while they weren't just absolutely certain they didn't want to tango with the American military, they did think it was still wiser to come to the bargaining table rather than try to interfere and cross paths with the Monroe Doctrine here. So the Monroe Doctrine was referring to Latin America, which had just had several countries declare their independence and become their own sovereign independent nations. Monroe was saying that no foreign power should interfere in this area, no intervention in this sphere of influence from Europe, and no more colonization was to occur in the Americas.
Today we want to go over a famous American poet, Walt Whitman, and just give you a brief overview of some of the high points of his extraordinary life, talk a little bit about him. So Walt Whitman was the second child of 9 children, and his full name was Walter Whitman Jr., named after his dad, but they called him Walt to distinguish him from Walter Sr. Walt Whitman was born on May 31st, 1819 in Long Island, New York, although he did most of his growing up in Brooklyn and ended his life in New Jersey. In between there, he spent some time living in Washington, D.C. and also in New Orleans. It was while he was in New Orleans that he was exposed to some of the brutality of slavery and issues related to that, and helped form some of his views of equality and support in many ways the Northern cause. And during the Civil War, he actually was in Washington, D.C., working at a hospital there for wounded vets, including his brother, nursing them back to health. So he stayed on in D.C. after the war as a clerk and worked for a time until his boss found out that he had written his most famous work, Leaves of Grass. His boss found it objectionable on moral grounds and fired him. So he had a very interesting life as he Grew up, he finished his formal schooling at 11, but he was a voracious reader, read constantly, and he loved the written word. His first job in Brooklyn was as a typesetter or printer until a fire swept through and destroyed pretty much the whole printing industry in that part of the town he was living in. He then went on to become a teacher in a one-room class, teaching several different grades as one teacher. If you've ever seen Little House on the Prairie, that's sort of what he was doing, only he was doing it in the Brooklyn area. So a teacher at a one-room schoolhouse. After that, he went on to become a journalist, founding and writing for several different newspapers. He worked as a nurse, as I said, during the Civil War, and then finally as a government clerk. During this time, he wrote his most important work called Leaves of Grass. It was self-published, and it included many of his poems, and Ralph Waldo Emerson loved his poems. And so he went through several editions, bulking it up, adding to it, as he printed these poems using what he called, or what has been styled or called free verse. And that style basically is very open and flowing and free, and he drew on themes that many Americans could resonate with, sort of the panoramic view. And we have these words here that have been used to describe him as poetry: idealistic, free, panoramic, democratic, egalitarian, and it tapped into the times that he was living in many ways, and evoked feelings from many of those who read it that really overwhelmed me. I thought, wow, this captures well in verse and in words what I feel and what I think about my country. And so he became very famous not only in America but worldwide, and would often receive monetary gifts and other support from people all over the world as they would read his book Leaves of Grass and be moved by that and said, we need to support this guy. He was very altruistic. Often the money he received, any extra money he received that he didn't need to live off of, he would spend to buy supplies to help nurse those who were recovering after the Civil War and injured. So he spent a lot of his money on others and struggled in many ways to live his life. He certainly didn't live in the lap of luxury, but spent a lot of his money and effort on helping others. As he reached his twilight years, he had a stroke and his health declined, and he died at the age of 72 in New Jersey. Well, this has just been a basic overview then of this famous American poet, Walt Whitman. And if you'd like to learn more about this or related matters, if you look underneath this video, you'll see a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website that has that information. And while you're at that website, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.